Rick Strom here, another version of Countdown to Kick Off. Let's head out to Denver with Dave Krieger of the Denver Post. Dave, how are you today?
Doing well, Rick. How are you?
I'm doing great. They obviously have a huge debate at quarterback, Kyle Orton or Tim Tebow. Were the Broncos ever close to pulling the trigger on a trade to send Kyle Orton to Miami?
In retrospect, they claim not. I think they were ready to do it, but the steps that had to occur were, number one, Kyle Orton and Miami had to come to an agreement on a contract extension. Miami was not interested in an $8 million cap hit this year. They were also not interested in giving up much for a player who's going to be a free agent at the end of this year. So they wanted to spread it out, make it a more cap-friendly number. Kyle Orton, if he was going to take a long-term contract and give up the chance to be a free agent at the end of the year, wanted starting quarterback money over a longer term. Miami wasn't quite ready to commit to that. So it never got to the point, according to the Broncos, where they actually got to the nitty-gritty of what the compensation from the Dolphins to the Broncos would be. The trade talks between the two had gotten to the point where the Broncos were ready to go ahead and do those negotiations for compensation if and when the Dolphins and Orton came to an agreement. The Dolphins and Orton never came to an agreement, so it didn't get there. But I think the bottom line is the Broncos were prepared at that point, which is just before training camp began, to go forward without Kyle Orton. When it fell through, Kyle Orton was in camp and clearly the best quarterback on the practice field, and so their plans changed.
At first, in training camp, reports said that Kyle Orton's a starter, and Brady Quinn was even playing better than Tim Tebow. Has there been any change?
Not really. Tim Tebow is very rough when it comes to, passing drills and that sort of thing. He misses throws that you basically expect any NFL backup quarterback to make. Brady Quinn has been better. I assume from a coaching standpoint he has graded better. He's just more accurate. He's got a good arm. He understands the offense. That doesn't mean, obviously, that he's necessarily better in games. Tim Tebow does have this sort of intangible quality that shows up in games. For all the throws that he's missed in training camp this year, and there have been plenty, he missed very few in the preseason game in the time that he got in, and he put up numbers that were pretty good. There is this position on the part of Tebow's backers that he's a game player, and Kyle Orton and Brady Quinn are better practice players. It brings to mind the old Allen Iverson line about practice. But nevertheless, coaches do make these judgments based on practice, and based on practice, I think objectively you would say Tebow would be running third. John Fox is a new coach. He's coming in with a fresh look at this. Everybody starts with a clean slate as far as he's concerned. We know from his time in Carolina that he's not a guy who really likes to go with unproven young players. He preferred fairly mediocre veterans to Jimmy Clausen while he still had the choice. Now, if Kyle Orton goes through the whole season, stays healthy, has a really good year, I don't know what happens. I don't know if they approach him and say, do you want to stay long term? I think right now Brady Quinn is clearly more economical because he's essentially the same guy without the resume, but roughly the same skill set as Kyle Orton, and he's a lot cheaper.
I've seen Kyle Orton play. Why do you think he does not get the respect that he plays for?
Well, because he hasn't, for all the numbers that he's put up in Denver, he hasn't won games. So he doesn't get a lot of respect here for that. His reputation coming out of Chicago was exactly the opposite. He won games. He didn't put up very good numbers. Here, under the Josh McDaniels offense, he's been very prolific in terms of numbers, hasn't won a lot of games. Now, it's certainly not entirely his fault. The defense was terrible last year, the worst in the league. They didn't have much of a running game. So his defenders have plenty of arguments to say that's not on him. Nevertheless, last year, in particular, his quarterback rating in clutch situations, which are defined in split statistics as fourth quarter of a game that's within 7 points either way, was terrible. It was 58 as opposed to an overall quarterback rating of 85. And that's sort of the impression that Broncos fans have, is that in the pinch, he's not a guy that comes through. He doesn't engineer fourth quarter comebacks. He's not a big clutch player. As opposed to Tebow, in the last 3 games that he started, the Broncos mounted fourth quarter charges in every one of them. They only won 1, but they were within a touchdown of the other 2. And Tebow just sort of made people think, gave the impression he could make things happen. And Orton is much more sort of a paint-by-the-numbers quarterback. The only drive the first team had in their first preseason game was sort of a microcosm of that. He drove them down between the 20s. He's great. He drove them down the field. They got into the red zone. He threw 3 incomplete passes. They kicked a field goal.
You mentioned the defense. They lost the main guy on defense, Elvis Dumervil, put up 17 sacks 2 years ago. How does he look thus far in training camp?
He looks great. He really does. They're back to a 4-3, so he's playing, the defensive end position that he played at Louisville where he put up all those sacks. Now, he did put up a ton of sacks as an outside linebacker for Josh McDaniels in the first year of the 3-4 here. But I think Elvis Dumervil is better suited to play defensive end. He was lost in coverage the few times that he was assigned to drop back into pass coverage. And knowing now that he is a defensive end and not a hybrid outside linebacker, he's added about 15 pounds this year. So he'll come in at 260, which is a lot for a guy who's, 5 foot 11 inches tall.
It seems that this injury has really hit home for him, and he seems like a very humble guy. How hard did the injury hit him last year?
Oh, very hard. I mean, it was, one of the very first days of training camp. It was a one-on-one drill. It just wasn't the sort of thing you expected to happen, a season-ending pec injury. He experienced what most players experience when they are looking forward to a season and it's taken away from them. But in addition to that, he had the letdown of having just signed a big contract. Mm-hmm. Broncos had finally committed some serious money to him, and Elvis has had this problem his whole career of actually sort of proving to people that he is what his numbers say he is, because his stature is so unusual. The prototypical pass-rushing defensive end looks a lot more like Julius Peppers than he looks like Elvis Dumervil. And so it took a long time for him to actually get the respect. He finally got the respect of a big contract. He's the guy. And then he goes down and misses the entire year. I think emotionally that was very difficult on both of those levels. One, that he couldn't play, and two, that he was letting everybody down. So I think it matters a great deal to him this year to come back and prove that he's worth that contract and that, he's as good as he was before the injury.
What's your first impressions on John Fox?
Well, very friendly guy. Sort of reminds you of a baseball guy when you talk to him, because he's always got a little pinch between the cheek and gum, and he's always spitting, which is much more of a baseball thing than a football thing. He's also arguably the worst interview of any head coach I've ever talked to.
Really?
And that's because he's unfriendly. He's very friendly. He just says absolutely nothing, and he says absolutely nothing on purpose. It's very important to him not to give stuff away. He's very old school that way. For example, he was asked quite innocently if Tebow would be the second quarterback into the first preseason game, and he declined to answer. He said that's not the kind of thing we give away from a competitive standpoint. And everybody thinks this is an exhibition game. Nobody cares. Does that mean it won't be Tebow? Is he actually dropping a hint there? And no, he wasn't. It was Tebow. He just literally was not willing to say before a game that didn't count who the second quarterback in would be, and that's just how he is. So he's a very friendly guy. He will say hello to everyone and sign autographs for fans, as he has throughout training camp. He gives a very friendly and positive public image, which is different from the Josh McDaniels public image to the fans here. But from a reporter's point of view, he's virtually worthless.